where I can find out what it is I'm going to say. I enjoy doing these, and I've been doing quite a bit lately. And I will advise you that I had a pretty busy day today. My wife and I were out at the regional market and spent a considerable amount of time and money getting spices and other things like that. And I may need to sit down during part of this. I had a back procedure within the last week, and we'll see what happens. I worked at the airport for 28 years. I was an employee of United Airlines, and then became part of the airport management system. When I retired, a number of my friends were talking to me about writing a story about the airport, and it took me a while to work up the courage to do that. I wrote a couple of other books first, but at one point, you may remember that there was a trailer park on Scottsville Road across from Olympic Park. Well, when that went down, you could actually see the original airport, the hangars of the original airport. And at that point, I looked in and I saw them and I said, it's time to write the book. So, tonight, because you are a neighbor to the airport, I changed the format of a little bit of the beginning to give you a little bit more perspective of the very early beginning than I have done for other places. I want to try to help you see what happened 100 years ago. First of all, it's hard to pin down when the original date is. It seems that the city took its time putting itself together, and the director of public works for the city selected the Britton Field in December of 1919. The city council approved it a year and a month later in January of 1921. They did nothing until after Charles Lindbergh came to town. Charles Lindbergh was, first of all, well, let me back up just a bit. The selection that the Director of Public Works made was 110 acres of land along Scottsville Road. It's the rectangle that's heavily marked. That's part of a 3,000 acre parcel that belonged to the Britton family. The Britton family had purchased it from the Wadsworth family. So there was some heavy financing going on there. A selection committee decided that this parcel of 110 acres, which was an airfield already, pilots that were brand new, because aviation was brand new. Aviation didn't come to New York State until 1908. There were about 7 or 8 airfields around the airport, around the city. The selection committee selected this one, this 110 acres. It's at 1313 Scottsville Road, and that facility is still there. The original development of that facility is still there. When they selected it, the mayor immediately said, "Okay, fine, we've got it. I'm not going to do anything with it." Now, World War I ended in 1918. When the World War ended, 2 things happened. Pilots were coming back who had gained experience during the Great War, and they wanted to use that experience in a professional way. So they wanted to fly, and they were interested in flying professionally. The second thing that was going on was, when the war was over, the Post Office Department decided that they wanted to experiment with airmail. They were interested in having their long distance letters being carried by air. So they, being the federal government, they immediately set rules for anybody that might want to have them land. And if they were going to, if a city wanted to have them land, then the city was going to have to develop a proper landing facility for the post office. But the federal government is the federal government, and it takes its sweet time going through its processes. So the mayor basically said, until I see real action, we're not going to put any money into this facility. However, the Chamber of Commerce immediately got involved and decided that they wanted to promote, for the business purposes, they wanted to promote the use of this, and they wanted to find out what could be done. A fellow by the name of Fred, I always forget his last name. Lost it, sorry. One of the members of the Chamber of Commerce decided that he would take over as chair of the Transportation Committee. And he immediately learned everything he could about what the post office wanted to do. He went to a conference, he came back fully loaded to go to the mayor's office and say, we need to develop the airport. The mayor said, nah, not yet. And so from the period of from 1921 until roughly 1927, Fred was constantly doing things to promote the airport. He was bringing people in to speak. He was convincing the businesses that they needed to speak up and tell the city what they needed. And he constantly was on their back. At one point, he said, and he got pretty heavy with in the newspapers. At one point he said, some fine morning we're going to awaken to find mail planes flying over Rochester without stopping, because our municipal landing field is not adequately equipped for use as an airmail station. And that was his position all the way along. What really pumped things up was when Charles Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic to Paris in 1927. Following his trip to Paris, Charles Lindbergh began a nationwide tour of about 50 or 60 cities. And one of those cities was Rochester. He came to Rochester in 1927, and in the summer of 1927, and gave to a crowd of about 20,000 people that came out to the airport. There was a lot of interest among the people because we had, for example, Glenn Curtis, who was from Hammondsport, and he had developed airplanes and was developing an aviation business. There were several manufacturing firms that manufactured either engines or tried to manufacture aircraft. Cunningham, I believe, tried to manufacture an aircraft, ended up with an automobile. That, you know, the automobile worked, the aircraft didn't. No, that's right. Never got off the ground. And so there were businesses that were involved in it, and people were seeing pilots doing air circuses, airbound circuses, the wing walking, and the barnstorming and things like that. They were seeing that happen. So there was an interest among the people, and when they found out that Lindbergh was coming, they swarmed the airport with 20,000 people. The city thought that they could impress Lindbergh, and they developed about an hour and a half's tour of the city, and he informed them that he would be here 30 minutes. and he would not be leaving the airport. What he did when he arrived was he flew 400 feet off the ground, down the course that he was going to be landing, toward the crowd, and when he hit the crowd, not physically, he took the airplane straight up, and as far as he could take it, and then he circled around and he came back and landed, and the crowd loved it. At that point, the mayor really had to say, okay, I give up, we'll get some money. Well, city council took another year. So what happened was that some 1927, the mayor said, okay. It wasn't until April of 1928 that the city council gave the director of public works the money to actually develop the airport. Which was fine, except that the airplane that was going to have its inaugural flight to Rochester was scheduled for June 1st. He had 40 days to develop the airport. I'm going to read a small piece. After a number of years later, there was a report done on the development of the airport, and this is part of what was written about that 40 days. Work was started on the runways on May 9th, 1928, and by June 1st, 10,000 cubic yards of excavation had been made for runways and trenches. Some 17,000 tons of stone had also been placed, covering an area of 40,000 square yards. In addition, other incidental work had been done. 4 Keystone gasoline shovels were employed in making the 6-inch cut for the runways, and 30 to 35 teams and wagons were used to haul the excavated material to one corner of the airport where it was flattened out and turned into automobile parking. So within 40 days, the Director of Public Works was able to develop a runway system, and so that the contracted airplane could land. This is the first airplane that landed in Rochester. It carried 100 pounds of mail, and it had 4 passengers. At the same time, now they were contracted to bring mail, and that was the whole purpose of aircraft initially, to bring mail, and to deliver mail. Contracted organizations like Colonial Western were providing services to airports all over the country at that point. One of those was American Airways. They were looking at it, the system, as, there's more than mail that needs to be carried. They were looking into the future and seeing the need for aircraft that would handle an adequate number of passengers. And American Airways started buying out the other contracted airlines, and eventually came to Rochester, bought out Colonial Western, and became American Airlines. They were our first, and for a long time, our only airline. This, by the way, is one of the, this is the digger that made the runway. Interesting piece of equipment I thought was worth looking at. This is a picture of hangar number 2, which is still there. It's in terrible condition, unfortunately. It has been condemned, and it's not usable at all, but it's still there. Hangar number 2 had that little piece that on the 2nd floor. That was the first air traffic control tower, except that the person that was in there could see 3 out of 4 ways. He couldn't see anybody coming from the south. And they decided after a couple of accidents that they really needed to have an air traffic control tower. What you're seeing here is the airport in 1930. This is when the city provided a grand opening. Now, mind you, they bought it selected it in 1919. I was talking to the airport director, and I suggested to him that we needed to have a centennial celebration. And he said, when would we have it? I said, it could be any time between 2021 and 2030. I said, but don't make it 2030 because I want to be able to be there. He's working on it. Supposedly, he's trying to have some recognition of a centennial, of the centennial, as part of the air show this summer. I informed him this morning that I had asked to be involved in it, and I said I haven't heard from anybody yet. So if they're planning it, they're not talking to me. So during the 1930s, now let me tell you, these 3 runways were A, B, and D. Don't ask me where C is because there was no C. But somehow I can't picture a pilot landing on runway A. Which direction? This way or this way? It took years for the aviation system, not just in Rochester, but everywhere. It took years for them to come up with the idea that there should be a number on the end of the runway. And that number should be different from the other end. The number equates to the compass heading that the pilot is flying as they're landing. So that when they're landing at 280 degrees, they're landing on runway 28. And that happens to be one of the runways that we have today. The 1930s, they continued to build. They built 2 more runways, a series of taxiways, and basically did improvements of the airport through the WPA, the Work Procedures Administration. It was part of a federally funded a project to help people get through the Depression. A tremendous amount of work was done on the airport. The runway system, the airfield system, and also hangar number 3 was built by them. So that in 1939, we now have hangars 1, 2, and 3, the 2 smaller ones, and then the larger one that's in the four part. That was built in 1939. That became, this now became the airport. This was the airline landing area where the passengers came, and hangar 3 became the office for the county and for the city and for American Airlines. That stayed in operation that way through the 40s. The 1940s started with a bang. They were extremely busy because of 2 things. One was the Aeronautical Act of 1926, which started, when the federal government said we were going to have an aviation system, they also said, and we're in charge, and we're going to make the rules. And they're still doing it, guess what? But that was through the Aeronautical Act of 1926. Part of that act was money to teach people how to fly. They wanted more people to fly. So there was a program put together to allow people to apply for ground control, ground school, and aviation. And that really took it in a big way. It became effective in the late 30s. At the same time, the Army Air Corps was developing a similar project. And so we had two projects going on to teach people how to fly. The civilian one, which was fairly harmless because when they learned how to fly, they could just fly. The military one, when they got their ticket to fly, they also got their ticket to be a pilot in World War II. So there was 1,000 people for several years. There was 1,000 people a year flying out of the Rochester airport. And in the learning process, that's a lot of takeoffs and landings, because that's the majority piece of your initial training in flying. So there was a tremendous amount. There was from early morning right through into the dark of the evening. There were airplanes taking off and landing and taking off and landing. And the people that were close to the airport were very, very concerned about it. Primarily the ones that were from the Brighton and Thru City area. It wasn't impacting you guys yet. In 1945, two more airlines came to Rochester. One was Pennsylvania Central. Its purpose was to take people from the Great Lakes area, not just Rochester, but the whole Great Lakes area, toward Washington, D.C. and bring them home. That ended up being Capital Airlines. Capital Airlines went defunct in approximately 1960, taken over by United Airlines. The other airline also started up in 1945, and that was Robinson Airways. They were providing basically puddle jumping services from Buffalo, Rochester to Syracuse, Syracuse to Utica. Guess who they became? Mohawk. And I always said, if I was going to be on an airplane that was going to have trouble in the wintertime, I would rather be on a Mohawk than on a larger carrier, because they had a whole lot more practice landing in the snow. The first time that Delta Airlines, based out of Atlanta, came to Rochester, they came in the winter, they tried to land, they took one look at our runway and said, "We're not landing, we're going away." And they went to their alternate. Yeah. By the end of the decade, the city realized that they were not going to be able to fund the airport anymore. World War II had brought us to a situation where the aircraft were bigger, the engines were stronger, there was a need for greater development of the airports because the runway systems weren't strong enough. And the city basically said, we need to be out of here. They began negotiating with Monroe County, and Monroe County took over the airport on January 1st, 1948. When the county took over, they had three projects in mind, right off the bat. The first was to develop a new east-west runway. That would be runway 1028. It went basically from the railroad tracks to what is now Route 390, but wasn't 390 then, of course. 5,000-foot runway, east-west. Aircraft taking off in that direction. We're going to be flying basically down Elmwood Avenue and past the hospital. The people in Brighton got real tired of that, of the use of that runway real fast. The second program that the county had was to take runway 119, the north-south runway, and lengthen it to 5,000 feet. Now that they had done that, they had two 5,000-foot runways that were built strong enough to handle the aircraft that we needed. And at that point, they turned to the third project, which was to build a new terminal off of Brooks Avenue. This is not exactly the newest, but this is long before any of us saw it. Coming in from Brooks Avenue, the main entrance came to a circle. And the first terminal building was 30,000 square feet of space. It was the first time that the terminal was strictly for passengers, and the airlines had gates. There were services provided in this terminal building. For the first time, there was a restaurant, there was retail shops, there was ground services provided that were not, all of which could not be provided on the Scottsville Road side. So the airlines moved from Scottsville Road over to Brooks Avenue. It took about 10 years for the city to discover, for the population to discover that we've got an airport and we have good airlines and we have good air traffic to other cities. And the population, the flying population, increased phenomenally to the extent that within 10 years, they had to double the size of the terminal. And in 1960, roughly 1960, I think they might have opened it in 1962. The terminal building was moved from 30,000 square feet to 60,000 square feet. This is basically what many of us remember of the old terminal. It's the 60,000 square foot terminal with United and Mohawk Airlines in this wing and American Airlines over here. You've got in the main lobby there were 3 ticket counters. There was if you recall, there was a Central Trust Bank in the main lobby. We had all kinds of services, and this is pretty much how the airport continued from that point, roughly 1962, until we built the terminal that we have now in 1989. That was the building. I'm going to jump ahead and tell you a little bit, just a moment, with my time with United Airlines. I went to work, I got out of college in 1965 and went to work for United Airlines in the summer of 1965 as a customer service agent. Using this airplane because I'm kind of fond of it in a strange way. I had a couple of incidents with it. I'm going to tell you about the most significant one. This was a Viscount. It is a 4-engine, jet-propelled prop airplane. The engines are jet. The jets rotated the props. It held 44 passengers, and the cargo area was basically the area below the white. I was working for United Airlines one day as a freight handling person. Myself and another person were putting mail on board the aircraft, and he was outside throwing it into the rear cargo pit. I was inside taking the bags and shoving them and packing them into the compartment. He got done. There was no reason for him to stick around, so he took off with his cart and his tractor. Somebody came along, looked inside, saw the pile and thought everything was done, and closed the door. And at that point I went, I think I'm going to Philadelphia. And this part of my brain that really wasn't functioning well said, I wonder what the guy in Philadelphia is going to do when he opens the door. Let's see. This airplane flies at 11,000 feet. There's still oxygen there, so I will be alive. But it's going to be really, really cold. And about that time I heard the first engine start. And my real brain kicked in and I said, do something, you dummy. I got on my back. Now, mind you, the cargo compartment is about 4.5 feet from top to bottom. I got on my back, I put my feet on the ceiling of the cargo compartment and I started stomping. Bam, 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 bam. Hoping somebody in the passenger compartment would recognize that there was a strange sound coming from underneath them. People don't like strange sounds in airplanes, right? Well, there was a passenger that was familiar and said, called the flight attendant over. He says, there's a weird sound coming here. She said, yes, I hear it. She said, I'll go up and tell the captain. Well, the captain didn't want to have anything to do with it. He was starting his engines. He wanted to get out of town. She convinced him to at least check into it. Before he started engines 3 and 4 on the other side, he had somebody come around, open the pit. When that guy opened the pit, I was past him before he knew I was there. I did not go back to that airplane for quite a while. That would have been an interesting trip. I worked for United Airlines for about 8 years, and during that time I decided I wanted to do something different. I found out that there was a thing called an assistant airport manager. And frankly, I liked the kind of work that that person did. Unfortunately, in Rochester, there's only one manager and one assistant. So you kind of have to get lucky. I made sure that I got to know the airport manager, and they knew that I was interested. So when a time came when an opening was coming up, I was called one day from work and told to go to the airport manager's office. I had no idea why. And when I arrived there, they interviewed me for the job, for the assistant manager's job. In January 1st, 1973, I became the assistant airport manager. Sam Cooper was the airport manager. He and I started on the same day, and it was a real revelation for the people that worked at the airport. We literally developed a new culture that day. I will give you an example. First day, we had 2 clerks that worked in the office. Unfortunately, they didn't talk to each other. But on this first day, the telephone rang, and Sam perked up his ears, and one of the clerks picked up the phone and said, "Airport maintenance." He got up and he walked to the door, and he listened to the conversation. "Yes, sir. We'll take care of that right away. Thank you for calling. Believe me, we'll take care of that right away." And she put the phone down. Sam said, "From now on, you will refer to this as the airport manager's office." And she looked at him and she went, "Mr. Cooper, that's going to confuse people. We've always called this airport maintenance." He said, "Airport maintenance is located over on Scottsville Road. This is the airport manager's office." And he turned around and went to his desk and sat down. That changed the culture. I'm not saying that the people that were there before us didn't do a good job. They had a different job in mind. They were caretakers. The management, Ed Houders and Pete Pierce, who were before, and I knew both of them quite well, did a great job, but they were the caretakers of 1,200 acres of land and a building that was on it. When Sam came in, Sam said, "I am the manager of a facility, and it's my job to make this facility successful." And he said, "I know that it has to be successful because we do need a new terminal building, and that's what I'm working toward." And he said that from day one. A second example of the simplicity of the place was a couple of days later, the clerk came to me, "Rick, you probably would like to learn how to open the safe." I said, "Sure, that's a good idea." I walked out behind her, walked toward the safe, and as I'm walking toward the safe, I saw the dial, and on the dial were 3 red marks, there, and there. what are those red marks for? She said, oh, I always forget the combination, so I just use my nail polish. And, okay. Metal note to self, change that fact immediately. It was a simple way of life. There was nothing in the safe to begin with. It was, petty cash was in the safe, and a couple of things that had been left at the airport. Other than that, there was nothing there. It was not of particular value. So the people that worked for the airport at that point learned a new way of doing things, and Sam and I came on pretty strong. We recognized that in order for the airport to be successful, in order for us to be able to one day build a new terminal, we were going to have to make sure that this terminal was financially secure. And at that point in time, it was nowhere close to financially secure. At that point in time, it was costing the taxpayer about $1 million a year. Any airport is supposed to break even. The intent is that an airport or a public facility gets enough revenue in and of itself that it will break even. It doesn't always happen, and that's not all bad, because it is a public service. So it's expected that the public will support it. But $1 million a year is a lot of support, and that had to stop. We immediately decided that one of the things that we had to do was to stop re-upping existing contracts. Sky Chef, for example, had come in 1953. They had given the airport, they didn't know what they were getting into. They were taking a big risk, so the airport really cut a good deal with them. That deal was like 25 or 30 years old, and we needed to find out if there was somebody else that would do that job and give us a better income. And that was true of every organization that worked at the airport. If you worked or had a business at the airport, you have a lease or an agreement with the airport. And we went through every one of those agreements, step by step by step, looking at them and making sure that they were up to date. The Sky Chef, for example, it took about a year. Now, nobody knew anything about how to operate a restaurant. I was called into Sam's office, and the Director of Public Works and Sam were there, and the Director of Public Works turned to me and said, Rick, I want you to give up everything that you're doing right now and give it to someone else. There was no one else to give it to. And take over and take this job as this is your sole job this year. You will learn what it is to run a restaurant. You will prepare the specifications, prepare the bid documents, and follow this thing through until we hopefully have a new vendor. We did get two bids. Sky Chef obviously was one of them. They gave us a moderate increase. Another was ARA. We didn't have any idea who ARA was. They were a name unfamiliar to us, completely unfamiliar. They offered us 30% of revenue and offered us over $1 million worth of renovation of their facility. Sky Chef's old contract had been at 10% of revenue. So that was a huge, huge increase. And what we had to do was make sure that they were a valid company. It took us a year to investigate them, to basically go through the process of getting the legislature to approve them. And it was a fun year in that I learned a lot. It was also a hard year in that it was a very difficult project. And there were some steps in it that were very unpleasant, particularly when the legislature said that I was a jerk. I had the opportunity to run this thing through and actually have success. And I consider it one of my major successes in the work that I was doing. We got ARA in, they just upped our revenues greatly, as did then the parking lot. We went from a national vendor to a local vendor. We were concerned that the local vendor might not do it, but they did a fantastic job and they're still doing it today. We did that with everything. I think it was 1978 when the airport broke even for the first time. And at that point, Sam said, we're on our way to a new terminal. Now, people have talked about the Greater Rochester International Airport, international being the key word. Let me just say that had nothing to do with whether or not we went to an international city. It had everything to do with increasing the image of the airport to match the image of our manufacturing base in Rochester, which was international. Kodak, Xerox, Bausch and Lomb, you name them. There were most of the manufacturers were international, and Sam felt that the Rochester Monroe County Airport name didn't give them sufficient image for their businesses, and he convinced the legislature to create the term Greater Rochester International Airport. I've heard that argument back and forth for years and years and years, and we will continue to hear it. There were, it wasn't all work. There were times that were breaks in the routine. There was you may remember that there were 53 people that were kidnapped and put in prison in Iran for 444 days. The person who was in charge of that group, the senior military person, was a fellow by the name of Colonel Schaefer. Colonel Schaefer came home. The day he came home, the county executive met him at the airplane to honor him, walked him out across to the terminal building, and he came through our offices. There was a small group of people in the offices. I had asked my wife and one of my children to be with to come and see him. And when he walked into our offices, he saw my daughter, who was 6 years old. He walked over to her, picked her up, and he said, "This is what I missed the most." And it was just, it was such a special time for my family, because my youngest daughter, Linda, was that child that he picked up. And he put her down and he thanked us and headed on into the press conference. That's a special day for us. We had presidents come. We had President Carter, Ford, Reagan, and Bush Sr. came for essentially for re-elections. I won't get into that in a big way, but the Secret Service would walk in about 3 days in advance of that. And when 3 people walked in suits, there's something about the Secret Service that you just know that they're not the average person. And they said, "We want to speak to the airport manager," and I pointed to it right there. 15 minutes later, Sam came out and he said, "The president will be here in 3 days." And the next 3 days were chaotic while they researched and made sure that we were safe and made sure the place was safe. Mrs. Carter was here one time on a trip, and she was flying commercially, and apparently the airplane was running late. So they gave her a room to sit in so that she didn't have to be out in the public, and both for her comfort and for her security. And Sam said to me, "Why don't you go down and visit with Mrs. Carter?" Okay. I had the most pleasant 30 minutes with Mrs. Carter. We talked about just all kinds of things, just a general nice conversation. She was the most wonderful lady. She got back to Washington and she signed a picture and sent it to me. And that again is another moment in my career that was pretty special.
Oops.
Walt Disney came to town one day. They were in a charter aircraft. The aircraft was going to be taking off mid-morning, and Sam convinced the crew to get dressed up and to take a ride around the ramp and kind of give the people who were working on the ramp a little bit of a fun time. I was riding with Pluto, and this is us saying goodbye. Pluto became my dear friend. I wanted to talk about security a little bit. I'll get to that in a moment. Security at the airport is something that is near and dear to my heart. I was more or less responsible for the security program. In 1973, the federal government decided that all airports needed to be certified. And in the certification process, we had to prove that our airfield operation was safe and effective, that we had a good fire crash rescue system, and that we had proper security at the airport. My piece of that was the proper security. When I started to work for the airport in 1973, we had 11 bomb threats at the airport. And I can tell you that if you were there, you did not know any one of those. You had no idea that that was happening. Because obviously we're not gonna, say to the page, over the page, to see we have a bomb threat. Everybody's gonna scream out, be screaming and leaving. The procedure would be, if you were to take this room, you would assign the person who is most familiar with this room, and that person would walk around the room and say, "Excuse me, is that bag yours?" "Yes, it is." "Thank you very much." And they're looking for something that's unidentified. And if they found that, they would report it, and then the bomb threat would come in, the bomb squad would come in, and they would check it out. Most of them were just invalid calls. They were threats that people were having fun. Until 1980. I think it was 1980. There was a bomb that went off in LaGuardia Airport. It had been put in a luggage compartment near the American Airlines departure area, and it went off and it killed, I think, 11 people and injured 75 or 80 people. And then pretty much every airport around the country started getting more threats. They were copycat threats. This happened on December 30th. December 31st, at the end of the day, I went home. Jackie and I were going to a party. We arrived at the party about 9 o'clock, and about 10 o'clock, there was a telephone call. "Mr. Iekel, we have a bomb threat at the airport." I kissed her goodbye. I said I would try to be home by midnight, and I headed out. We searched the terminal building. Everything was fine. About 11:30, everybody had come in. Everybody had said they didn't find anything. Sam called an all clear. At that point, the telephone rang. The dispatcher picked it up, listened, put it back down, and he said, "Mr. Cooper, that was the same voice as the voice that called earlier. And he said the bomb is going to go off at midnight." Sam looked at me and said, "We're going to evacuate the terminal." Now, any ordinary day at midnight, it would have been pretty well evacuated anyway, but this was New Year's Eve. Sky Chef had a rip-roaring party going on with well over 100 people having a great time. I went up to Sky Chef and said, they have to leave. You're kidding. I'm not kidding. Tell them to get up, get their baggage, get their purses, whatever, and leave the airport and get in their cars and go. And we told the parking lot operator, put the gate up and let them go. Within 5 minutes, those 100 and some people left, cleared the terminal building, and were out of the airport and gone. Sky Chef lost thousands of dollars that night. Now, to their credit, many of the people came back and said, we owe you some money. That's the kind of general reaction that I really love about people. Sam and I left the terminal building. We went a respectable distance away, and as we're standing there at about 2 minutes before midnight, Sam looked at me and he said, so which end of the building is going to go up? And I said, I don't know. Both of us expected one end of the building to go up. It didn't. So we were very lucky that night. Long about the Deregulation Act of 1978, was an act that was enacted to discontinue the operation of the Civil Aeronautics Board. The Civil Aeronautics Board had been put together to control the airlines, so that to tell the airlines where they could fly and how much they could charge, because the airlines were new and the federal government needed a control. Everyone, passengers and airlines, were saying to the government, let us go. Let us be deregulated. Let us compete with each other. So the Deregulation Act of 1978 was passed by, I think it was President Carter. It didn't really impact Rochester until about 1980. The first impact was that our large carriers started looking at the places that they weren't making money. If somebody flew into Binghamton, they pretty much said, Binghamton's going to do without us, and they stopped going. When they stopped going to Binghamton, somebody else came to Binghamton and said, we want to fly here, we'll take over for them. And that kind of thing started. This is a chart of the airlines that came and went during the course of about the next decade. And there were times, now honestly, the terminal building was built for 3 airlines, and the 3 airlines had leased all of the airline space with exclusive leases. So Sam and I had nothing to give them when an airline wanted to come in. They had to negotiate with the existing airlines, and they did. There were times when I didn't know what airlines were here. Honestly, they would come and go in the course of a week sometimes. What I have tracked here is a number of airlines that had some significant order. Of course, we have American, United, and Allegheny, which became US Air. We have Eastern Airlines, which came in about that time, and they came in under a normal circumstance. They were going to come anyway. Air North, Brockway, Mall Airline. Mall Airline was a one-engine aircraft like that first one in 1928. Passengers would be going out, planning on going out on one of the jets, and the jet maybe got overfilled or was late, and they sent them over to Mall. If you want to go to Albany, go to Mall. The passengers would get to the door, look at the Mall, and say, no, thank you. So there was Empire, Air New England, Altair, you may recognize some of these names. Business Express, Best Airline lasted 2 years. New York Airways, Piedmont, Republic, Northwest, People Express. Great story here. People Express gave you a seat. There was no ticket counter. I don't know if did anybody ever travel on People Express? You walked out to the airport, right? Airplane? Right there. When I was in RIT, finishing up by getting my bachelor's degree, I took a transportation economics course, and one of the things that we did was we talked about the airlines. And I came home one night and I said to my wife that, airlines should just go point A to point B. I mean, just don't give them a meal, don't do all the fancy stuff, give them a seat. They want to get from point A to point B. And that was my theoretical self talking. People Express came into town. They had a reputation that every airport person said, oh God, we just turned into Greyhound Station. I came home that night and I went, oh, People Express came to town. She says, what happened to point A to point B? She has a way. So those are the airlines that came and went, and it got pretty crazy in there because there were so many people coming and going in this airport that was built for 3 airlines back in 1960. This is what the airport looked like after in the late 80s. And there are expansions on it because the airlines had to expand in spite of us. And so this is essentially what you saw until we demolished this and built the terminal that we have today. In 1989, and I know I'm over at this point and I will try to speed this up. 1989, Sam retired, I became the airport manager. In 1989, we started the construction of the new terminal building. It was not simple at all. The new terminal building was a 2-story building, and it was on top of the old building. So that what you see here is the white is the profile of the old building. The dark is the addition, and an addition both first floor and second floor. The project was, of course, over the course of 3 years. There were major pieces to it. The entrance moved down, and so that it came over Brooks Avenue near the railroad track and came in, and had plenty of time to make a decision as you were coming in. In front of the terminal building, we built a bridge, all while we were taking care of the passengers that were going that day or that week or that month. The terminal building itself, this wing was phase 1. Phase 2 included this half of the main. Phase 3 included this half and this. My job, I felt that my job as the airport manager, I was deeply involved in that entire project in terms of planning and all, but I felt that our job at the airport was to make sure that there was a safe path for the passengers to get from their vehicle through all of that construction to the airplane, or from the airplane through all of that construction. The construction which changed daily. Project here, project there, project there. And they were constantly moving around. I felt I needed to make a safe path with proper signage so that the passenger always knew that they were going in the right direction. And from what I heard from business people, when it was all over, they said that we did a great job, and I was very pleased with that. The terminal was finished in 1992. It was dedicated I think it was the spring of 1992. I stayed on for another year and then went to one of the other departments in the county. I want to close by showing you the beginning and the end. We've come a long way. So thank you very much. I hope you come up and take a look at the book or the books that are here. If you're interested, get one. And I hope you've enjoyed what I have to say, and I'm available for questions and answers to any extent you want. Thank you very much.